Do you know which movement changed the way we make and perceive art? We interact with art every day, so it's useful to learn how it has evolved throughout the centuries. Impressionism challenged preconceived notions of classical art and shaped the modern art world as we know it today. I'm an art major, and Impressionism is one of my favorite movements. I want to emulate the techniques they used, and the best way to do that is through learning about the movement itself. Also, I'm currently taking an art history course that covers the Renaissance to the present day, so these concepts are fresh in my mind. I'll go over a brief history of the Impressionist art movement, how artists were valued before Impressionism, and end with how Impressionism impacts art today. So let's start with a little bit of history. The Impressionist movement was a relatively short period during the last quarter of the 19th century, particularly the 1870s to 1880s, where artists attempted to capture the fleeting moments and lighting of the dynamic world. Richman-Abdou's article about Impressionism on the My Modern Met website notes that Impressionism originated in Paris, France, when a small group of artists who frequented similar cafes wanted to challenge creative norms. Since no exhibits would take their works, they came together as the Cooperative and Anonymous Association of Painters, Sculptors, and Engravers to put on their own exhibitions and get their art noticed. The article then goes on to describe the hallmarks of Impressionist works as visible brushstrokes, bright colors used straight from the tube, a focus on lighting, and photographic crop positions or creative cropping. One of the biggest shifts that caused the most controversy during the Impressionist movement was painting daily life rather than religious and mythological scenes. If it's messy, it's probably Impressionism. Think of it as the artist giving the viewer an impression of a moment. Now, that's not why it's called Impressionism, but it's a really easy way to remember it. Mark Cartwright, World History Encyclopedia's main publisher, notes that the name Impressionism actually came from the derogatory term most critics used at the time to describe their style as vague and unfinished. Critics were staunch supporters of the classical belief of art that often barred artists from more stylized and expressive works. Classical beliefs of art were nearly opposite to the ideas Impressionism was trying to push. Michael Baxandall published a book, Painting and Experience in 15th Century Italy, that takes a deep dive into the values and processes of making artwork during the Renaissance. Paintings then were usually seen as luxury goods only bought by the wealthy, the city governments, and usually the church. They were meant to represent lifelike depictions of religious or mythological icons. And the Renaissance artists depended on commission, and this is where the trope of the starving artist comes into play. These artists were working from paycheck to paycheck or commission to commission and had very little freedom other than what their contracts allowed, and it was usually very little since, the patrons wanted a very specific type of work to be produced. Cartwright also wrote an article on the life in a Renaissance workshop, and he synopses that during the Renaissance, artists were usually seen as craftsmen in the same way that blacksmiths and shoemakers were. Sometimes they were even seen as pharmacists due to their expertise with mixing pigments. Most artists started very young and worked their way up through the workshop by apprenticing. However, by the tail end of the Renaissance, true artists were recognized as the scholarly, intellectual jacks of all trades. Despite the ideal Renaissance man, realism was still the only benchmark for painterly skill, and this persisted until the Impressionist movement. Impressionism was the catalyst for modern art movements. In his book How Impressionism Conquered the World, author Philip Hook describes Impressionism as, quote, the first modern art, end quote, because of the public controversy the style caused, which has been reflected in nearly every subsequent art movement. Artists were publicly critiqued and scorned in newspapers for the hallmarks of their works, such as bright colors and the shift away from religious painting. Words from Claude Monet, quote, dealers and collectors turn their back on me. It is saddening to see how little interest there is, end quote. And words from Edward Manet, quote, insults are beating down on me like hail. I've never been through anything like it, end quote. These artists were breaking away from the strict rules and opening up more possibilities for art, not only as a career, but also for recreation. It's really important to view Impressionist works not as primitive or lesser quality. These artists were all formally trained, and they weren't using their movement as a way to excuse low skill levels. Try to think of them as moving on as after they have mastered realism. Dr. Zoe Jones, the art history professor here at UAF, poses the question, what do you do after you master realism? You start to abstract and distort forms and be more imaginative with what you're doing. Following movements, Cartwright specifically mentions Neo Impressionism, but others like Expressionism with Van Gogh's Starry Starry Night, or really abstracted movements from Picasso and the Cubist movement, all set to challenge barriers even more and spark the innovation of new techniques, just like the Impressionist movement. Ultimately, Impressionism has influenced every subsequent work in some capacity due to the revolutionary changes on what constitutes a good piece of art. Despite the short time period where Impressionism took place, artists were able to challenge the fundamentals of classical art that valued realism over expression and paved the way for modern art movements. And they're still influencing all types of art made today. If you've ever read comics or felt strongly about a work of art, Impressionism very likely had a hand in it, since it started the chain reaction of expanding the creative bounds and methods of interpreting art. Thank you.